The word stage 3 hung in the sterile hospital air like a death sentence, but what broke my heart wasn't the cancer. It was watching my son Marcus shift uncomfortably in his chair, checking his phone while the oncologist explained how my body was betraying me. I'm Sarah Chen, 52 years old, and I thought I knew what rock bottom felt like until that Tuesday afternoon in September when everything I believed about family crumbled faster than my white blood cell count. Before we dive deeper into this story that changed everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the people we trust most, I want you to do something for me. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because what happened to me could happen to anyone, anywhere, and I need to know I'm not alone in this. Hit that subscribe button too, because this story gets darker before it gets lighter, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Dr. Martinez continued explaining treatment options, but all I could focus on was Marcus fidgeting with his wedding ring, the same gold band I'd helped him pick out 3 years ago when he married Jessica. Back then, I thought I was gaining a daughter. Now, sitting in that cold examination room, I was beginning to realize I might have been losing a son instead. Marcus had always been my miracle baby, born when I was 28, after 3 miscarriages that left me hollow and questioning everything. His father, David, left when Marcus was just 2, said he couldn't handle the responsibility, couldn't handle me. So it was just the 2 of us against the world for 18 years. I worked double shifts at the textile factory, sacrificed everything, sold my grandmother's jewelry to pay for his college tuition. When other single mothers were dating or building careers, I was at his soccer games, helping with homework, being both mother and father. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now fighting for my life in the same hospital where I'd brought Marcus into this world. The same hands that had held him as a newborn were now shaking as I gripped the plastic chair, trying to process words like chemotherapy and 6-month prognosis without aggressive treatment. Dr. Martinez handed me a stack of pamphlets, her voice gentle but clinical. Treatment would be extensive, expensive even with insurance. I'd need someone to drive me to appointments, help with daily tasks during the worst days. I looked at Marcus hopefully, but he was staring at his phone screen, thumb scrolling through what looked like social media posts. That's when Jessica spoke up for the first time since we'd arrived. Her voice was sharp, impatient. She suggested I look into care facilities and professional assistance. The way she said it made it sound like I was a burden they'd already calculated the cost of carrying. Marcus nodded along, never once meeting my eyes. Walking to the parking lot afterward, I tried to hold Marcus's hand like I used to when he was scared. He pulled away, mumbling something about needing to get home to walk their dog. Their dog. Not our dog, not the dog. Their dog had become more important than his dying mother. That night, alone in my small apartment, I stared at the prescription bottles lined up on my kitchen counter like tiny soldiers preparing for war. The silence was deafening. For 24 years, this place had been filled with Marcus's laughter, his friends, his music, his life. Now it felt like a tomb. I called him around 10 p.m., hoping maybe the shock had worn off. Maybe he'd want to talk about treatment plans or how we'd get through this together. Jessica answered instead, her tone cold and efficient. Marcus was processing and needed space. She'd call me in a few days once they'd figured out logistics. Logistics. Like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person fighting for survival. As I lay in bed that night, ceiling fan creaking overhead, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be their burden. I wasn't going to beg for love from people who saw me as an inconvenience. I was going to fight this cancer on my own terms, with my own strength, just like I'd fought every other battle in my life. What I didn't know was that in 3 weeks, everything would change again. Marcus would call me, voice shaking with excitement, talking about numbers and dreams and a future that suddenly seemed brighter. A future that would reveal just how deep betrayal could cut, and just how sweet revenge could taste when served at exactly the right temperature. But that night, all I knew was the ache in my chest that had nothing to do with cancer cells and everything to do with the slow, devastating realization that the child I'd devoted my life to raising had somehow grown into a stranger who couldn't even hold my hand while I faced death. The first chemotherapy session was scheduled for the following Monday. I'd be going alone. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after my diagnosis. I was sitting at my kitchen table, forcing down half a slice of toast, the only thing that didn't make me nauseous anymore, when my phone exploded with Marcus's voice, higher pitched than I'd heard it since he was 12 years old. He was screaming, actually screaming, about numbers and tickets and winning. At first, through the fog of my morning medications, I thought something terrible had happened. But as his words started making sense through the static of my chemo brain, I felt my heart do something I hadn't expected it to do in weeks: skip with hope. $30 million. Those were the words that cut through everything else. Marcus and Jessica had won $30 million in the state lottery. Within an hour, they were at my door, Jessica clutching a wrinkled piece of paper like it was made of gold. Marcus pacing my small living room like a caged animal drunk on possibility. For the first time since my diagnosis, he was really looking at me, really seeing me, his eyes bright with tears of joy instead of the awkward pity I'd grown accustomed to. They'd bought the ticket at the gas station on Maple Street, the same one where I used to stop for milk when Marcus was little. 5 random numbers and a Powerball that had somehow aligned to create a miracle. The timing felt like fate, like the universe apologizing for the cancer, for David leaving, for all the years of struggle. Marcus kept saying we as he described their plans. We could buy a house. We could travel. We could get the best doctors, the best treatment. For the first time in weeks, he hugged me, really hugged me, and I felt the warmth of my son returning, felt the love I'd been desperate to find hiding behind his recent distance. Jessica was different too, her usual sharp edges softened by dollar signs and possibility. She talked about paying off their student loans, buying a new car, maybe even starting the family they'd been putting off. When she mentioned wanting to take care of me during treatment, to hire private nurses and find the best oncologists money could buy, I actually cried. Relief, gratitude, love, all of it poured out of me in ugly, grateful sobs. We spent the morning making plans. Marcus had already called his job to quit. He'd been managing a small electronics store, barely making enough to cover their rent. Jessica would finish out her contract at the law firm but wouldn't renew. They talked about buying a big house with space for me to live with them, about how money would never be a problem again. The ticket was safely tucked in Jessica's purse, she said. They'd already looked up the claiming process, scheduled an appointment with a financial advisor, started researching lawyers who specialized in lottery winnings. Everything was being done right, carefully, thoughtfully. That afternoon, I felt stronger than I had since the diagnosis. Hope is a powerful drug, stronger than any chemotherapy cocktail. We went out to lunch, my first restaurant meal in weeks, and for 3 hours, it felt like we were a real family again. Marcus told old stories, Jessica laughed at his terrible jokes, and I felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. But as the day wore on, I started noticing small things. The way Jessica kept touching her purse, protective and possessive. How Marcus had already started talking about their money instead of the money. The moment when Jessica's phone rang and she stepped outside to take the call, leaving Marcus and me alone for the first time in weeks. That's when he said something that should have been a warning, but in my desperate gratitude, I let it slide past me like water. He mentioned how lucky they were that the ticket was in Jessica's name, how it made the legal stuff simpler. When I asked what he meant, he got vague, said something about joint assets and marriage laws that I didn't really understand. What I did understand was that for the first time in weeks, my son was looking at me with something other than obligation or pity. He was looking at me with love again, and I was so hungry for that love that I didn't question its sudden return. That evening, after they left, I called my sister Linda in Phoenix to tell her the good news. She was happy for us, but there was something in her voice, concern, maybe, or caution. She'd always been the practical one, the one who saw through people's bullshit faster than anyone else. She asked me if I'd seen the actual ticket, if my name was on it anywhere. When I said no, that it was Jessica's ticket, Linda got quiet. Then she said something that I should have listened to more carefully. Sarah, honey, just make sure you know where you stand legally. Money changes people, even good people. I laughed it off then. Marcus was my son, Jessica was family now, and $30 million was enough for everyone. What could possibly go wrong? The next morning, I woke up feeling more optimistic than I had in months. My next chemo session was scheduled for the following Tuesday, but now I wouldn't be going alone. Now I had a family who cared, who could afford the best care, who saw me as more than just a burden to be managed. I had no idea that in less than a week, I'd be lying in a hospital bed, watching that same family walk away from me forever, leaving me with nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal and a secret that would change everything. But that Thursday morning, as I made coffee and planned what to do with my second chance at life, all I felt was gratitude. Gratitude and the first real hope I'd had since hearing those 2 terrible words, stage 3. The first sign something had changed came during my second chemotherapy session. Marcus was supposed to drive me, but he called that morning with an excuse about meeting with lawyers and financial advisors. His voice was different, distant, hurried, like I was interrupting something important. What really stung was how he said it. Not "I'm sorry, Mom, something urgent came up, but you'll have to figure out another way to get there today." Like I was an inconvenience disrupting his important new life rather than his dying mother needing basic support. I sat there holding the phone after he hung up, feeling something shift inside my chest. It wasn't just disappointment, I'd been dealing with that for weeks now. This was the first whisper of a darker realization, the beginning of understanding that the lottery money hadn't made them more generous with their love. It had made them more selective about where they spent their time. Jessica offered to take me instead, but even her offer came with conditions. She could drop me off but couldn't stay. She had appointments with interior designers and real estate agents. Her tone was bright, almost manic, like someone high on possibility and drunk on dreams that had suddenly become achievable. During the drive to the hospital, she was unusually chatty, but it was a strange kind of conversation. She talked at me rather than with me, describing a life I wasn't really part of despite her occasional use of we and us. She showed me pictures on her phone of the house they were looking at, a 6-bedroom mansion in Riverside Heights, the kind of neighborhood I'd driven through but never dreamed of living in. The house was stunning, all glass and steel and clean lines that spoke of money in ways I'd never experienced. Indoor pools, wine cellars, a 4-car garage, manicured gardens that probably cost more to maintain than I used to make in a year. Jessica scrolled through dozens of photos, pointing out features like heated bathroom floors and smart home technology that could control everything from lighting to security systems with voice commands. When I asked about the guest quarters being for me, she got vague in that way people do when they're trying to avoid saying something hurtful directly. She said they were still figuring out the logistics of everything, that there were many factors to consider when making such big decisions. That word again. Logistics. Like my terminal cancer diagnosis was a scheduling conflict to be managed rather than a crisis requiring family unity. But what bothered me more than her evasiveness was her enthusiasm. She talked about marble countertops and walk-in closets with the same breathless excitement other people reserved for discussing miracles or falling in love. Every sentence began with "we're going to" or "we can finally" or "we'll never have to worry about," and with each declaration, I felt myself disappearing from their future more completely. The strangest part was how she kept mentioning money in ways that felt almost compulsive. Not just the big purchases like the house and cars, but smaller details that seemed designed to remind me, and herself, that they were wealthy now. The bottled water she'd brought cost $12. Her new purse was Italian leather, handcrafted, worth more than my monthly rent. Even her coffee that morning had been from some specialty shop that charged $23 for a single bag of beans. It was like she was performing wealth, trying it on like an expensive dress to see how it fit, to see if spending money extravagantly made her feel as important as she thought it should. And maybe, underneath all that performance, she was trying to convince herself that they deserved this windfall, that $30 million had fallen into their laps because they were the kind of people who belonged in mansions and Porsches. What she didn't say, what neither of them had said since the lottery win, was anything specific about my care. No mention of the private doctors they'd promised, no discussion of treatment options money could buy, no plans for the kind of support system I'd need during the worst days of chemotherapy. All their concrete plans involved things, houses and cars and luxury items, while their promises to me remained vague and theoretical. The chemotherapy infusion took 4 hours, and Jessica stayed for exactly 63 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall, counting down the moments until her restlessness became too obvious to ignore. She spent most of that first hour on her phone, not taking calls but scrolling through what looked like shopping websites. I could see her screen from my reclined chair, jewelry sites, luxury clothing stores, high-end electronics retailers. Every few minutes she'd show me something, a diamond necklace that cost more than I'd made in 3 months at the factory, a handbag that was apparently iconic and investment-worthy, watches that she described as classic pieces with the reverence other people reserved for discussing art or family heirlooms. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was shopping for luxury goods while I was hooked up to an 4 drip of chemicals designed to keep me alive. But what hurt more was her obvious distraction, the way she kept glancing at her phone even when she was supposedly focused on talking to me. When the nurse came by to check my vitals and explain what to expect during the longer stages of treatment, Jessica's attention wandered completely. She started texting someone, Marcus, I assumed, about scheduling appointments with contractors and designers. I could see fragments of the conversation, granite or quartz, and infinity pool definitely and guest house renovation timeline. Guest house. Not guest room, not space for me in their main house, but a separate building entirely. The separation was becoming more literal by the hour. It was during the second hour that Jessica's phone rang with what she called an urgent appointment she'd forgotten about. She gathered her expensive purse and Italian leather jacket with the kind of relief people show when escaping something unpleasant, promising to be back before my treatment was finished. She wasn't. I sat in that reclining chair for 2 more hours, watching other cancer patients with their families, their friends, their support systems. The woman next to me had her daughter reading to her from a romance novel, both of them laughing at the ridiculous dialogue. Across the room, an elderly man held his wife's hand while she dozed through her treatment, occasionally stroking her hair or adjusting her blanket. I tried not to feel sorry for myself, but the contrast was impossible to ignore. These people had others who saw their treatment as something to be shared, endured together, faced as a team. I had someone who saw it as an inconvenience that interfered with furniture shopping and spa appointments. When my treatment was finally finished, I called Jessica's phone repeatedly. No answer. The nurse helped me to the discharge area, where I waited another 45 minutes before accepting that my ride wasn't coming. I ended up calling a taxi, spending money I couldn't really afford on a trip home that should have been covered by family. The taxi driver was kinder than my daughter-in-law had been. He helped me into the house, carried the bag of anti-nausea medications the hospital had given me, even asked if I needed him to stay until I was settled. His concern felt more genuine than anything I'd experienced from Marcus or Jessica in weeks. That evening, when Marcus finally called, his voice carried a different energy than I'd heard before. Not excitement exactly, but something harder, confidence mixed with entitlement, like someone who'd just realized he held all the power in a relationship and intended to use it. He asked how my treatment went, but it was the kind of perfunctory question people ask when they want credit for caring without actually wanting details. When I mentioned feeling abandoned and having to take a taxi home alone, he got defensive rather than apologetic. "Mom, you have to understand that we're dealing with a lot right now," he said, and I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, feeding him lines. "This money changes everything for us, and we have responsibilities now. We can't just drop everything every time you need something." Every time I need something. Like chemotherapy was a whim rather than life-saving treatment, like having cancer was an inconvenience I'd chosen to inflict on their busy schedules. But it was his next comment that really showed me how much had changed. "Besides, you're going to have to learn to handle some things independently eventually. We can't be your caretakers forever." Caretakers. The word hit me like a physical blow. Not family, not loved ones who wanted to support me through the hardest fight of my life, but caretakers, people whose job it was to manage my problems until they could find a way to transfer that responsibility to someone else. That's when I understood something fundamental about Marcus that I'd been too blind to see before. His love had always been conditional, based on what I could provide rather than who I was. When I was working double shifts to pay for his education, cooking his meals and washing his clothes and attending every game and school event, I was valuable to him. When I was healthy and self-sufficient, asking for nothing more than occasional phone calls and holiday visits, our relationship worked. But now that I needed more than I could give, now that I was expensive and inconvenient and dying, his true feelings were emerging. I wasn't his mother in any meaningful sense. I was a burden he'd inherited, a responsibility he'd never wanted and was now wealthy enough to delegate to professionals. The conversation that night lasted exactly 12 minutes. I know because I stared at the clock the entire time, watching the seconds tick by while my son explained all the reasons he couldn't be bothered to care for his dying mother. He talked about boundaries and healthy relationships and enabling behavior, therapy speak designed to make abandonment sound like wisdom. When I hung up, I sat in my small kitchen surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd built around someone who saw me as an obligation rather than a person. The medication bottles lined up on the counter like tiny soldiers preparing for a war I might have to fight alone. The refrigerator covered with pictures of Marcus growing up, birthday parties I'd planned, baseball games I'd attended, graduation ceremonies I'd cried through with pride. All of it suddenly felt like evidence of a massive miscalculation, years of love invested in someone who'd been keeping emotional receipts the whole time, tallying up what he owed me and what I'd cost him, waiting for the moment when he had enough money to settle the account and walk away. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the ceiling fan creak overhead, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to stop calling them. Stop reaching out, stop trying to maintain a relationship that had clearly become one-sided, stop begging for love from people who saw my need as weakness rather than an opportunity to show care. I was going to let them show me who they really were without my interference, without my attempts to excuse their behavior or rationalize their cruelty. If they wanted to be a family, they knew where to find me. If they didn't, I would finally have the truth about what our relationship had always really been. What I didn't know was that my silence would make them panic in ways their guilt never had. That cutting off my desperate attempts to connect would force them to confront what they'd become in ways they weren't prepared for. And that their panic would lead to mistakes, big, arrogant, legally actionable mistakes that would give me the ammunition I needed for a fight I hadn't even known was coming. The changes accelerated from there, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Plans to look at houses together never materialized. When I asked about the private doctors they'd mentioned, Marcus said they were still researching options and would get back to me. 2 weeks after their big win, I hadn't seen them in person once. I started calling more often, desperate to maintain the connection we'd seemed to rebuild. Jessica usually answered Marcus's phone now, and her responses grew increasingly cold. They were busy, she said. Lots of meetings, lots of decisions to make. They'd call me back later. They never did. The real blow came on a Wednesday afternoon when I was walking past the bank on Main Street and saw them through the window. Marcus and Jessica, dressed in expensive clothes I'd never seen before, sitting across from someone in a suit, signing papers. Marcus was wearing a watch that caught the light, gold, expensive, nothing like the simple digital watch he'd worn for years. I stood there for 10 minutes, debating whether to go in. We were family, after all. I should be part of these conversations, these decisions. But something in their body language, the way they leaned away from the door, the way Jessica kept glancing toward the street like she was watching for something, made me hesitate. That hesitation saved me from what would have been a humiliating scene, because as I watched, Jessica pulled out her phone and made a call. Even through the window, even without hearing the words, her expression told me everything I needed to know. She was complaining about someone, gesturing in a way that looked frustrated, annoyed. She was talking about me. I walked home that day feeling smaller than I had since my diagnosis. The cancer was eating away at my body, but this was worse. This was watching my family eat away at my soul, bite by careful bite. That night, Linda called to check on me. I tried to sound positive, tried to maintain the fiction that everything was fine, but she saw through it immediately. She asked direct questions. Had I seen the ticket? Was my name on anything official? Had they set up any kind of trust or account for my medical expenses? The answer to all of it was no. Linda's silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Then, in the gentle but firm voice she'd used when we were kids and she was trying to protect me from bullies, she said what I'd been afraid to think. Sarah, I think you need to prepare for the possibility that this money isn't going to help you the way they promised. I wanted to argue with her, wanted to defend Marcus and Jessica, wanted to believe that the family I'd helped create wouldn't abandon me when I needed them most. But late that night, lying in bed with my body aching from chemotherapy and my heart aching from something worse, I started to see the pattern I'd been desperately trying to ignore. The sudden affection after my diagnosis hadn't been about love. It had been about guilt, about doing the right thing for a few hours before reality set in. And the reality was that I was expensive, inconvenient, and dying. The $30 million hadn't made them want to take care of me. It had given them the means to take care of themselves without having to worry about me at all. But I still had one card to play, one secret that none of us understood yet. Because while Jessica had been so careful about keeping that ticket safe, while they'd been so thoughtful about legal advice and financial planning, there was one small detail they'd overlooked. A detail that would make all the difference in the world. The problem was, I wouldn't discover it until it was almost too late. Until I was lying in a hospital bed, abandoned and alone, listening to words that would shatter what remained of my heart before ultimately leading to the sweetest revenge I could have ever imagined. The call that changed everything came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in November. I woke up in a pool of my own sweat, my body convulsing, blood trickling from my nose onto the pillowcase. The pain in my abdomen was unlike anything the chemo had thrown at me before, sharp, insistent, like something vital was tearing apart inside me. I managed to dial 911 between waves of nausea, managed to unlock my front door before collapsing on the couch. The paramedics found me there 20 minutes later, conscious but barely, my blood pressure dropping fast enough to scare them into running red lights all the way to St. Mary's Hospital. Emergency surgery. Internal bleeding. Complications from the chemotherapy that my body couldn't handle anymore. I woke up 18 hours later with tubes down my throat and machines beeping around me like electronic prayers. The first face I saw was Dr. Martinez, and her expression told me everything I needed to know before she said a word. The cancer had spread. The treatment wasn't working. We were running out of options and time. I asked for Marcus, my voice barely a whisper around the breathing tube they'd finally removed. Dr. Martinez looked uncomfortable, said they'd been trying to reach my emergency contacts but hadn't gotten through. In my drugged haze, I didn't think much of it. Marcus and Jessica were probably busy, probably dealing with their new life, their new money. They'd come as soon as they got the message. But hours passed, then a full day, and my phone stayed silent. I finally managed to call Marcus myself on Wednesday evening, my hands shaking as I dialed the number I knew by heart. Jessica answered, and her voice was different, colder than I'd ever heard it, with an edge that cut through my post-surgical fog like a scalpel. When I told her where I was, what had happened, there was a pause that lasted too long. Then she said something that would haunt me for the rest of my life, however long that might be. "Sarah, we've been talking, and we think it might be better if you handled your medical situation independently from now on." Independently. Like I was a business they were dissolving a partnership with. I asked to speak to Marcus, sure that hearing his voice would somehow make this make sense. But when he finally got on the phone, he sounded like a stranger. He talked about boundaries and toxic relationships and moving forward in a healthy way. Words that sounded like they'd come from some self-help book or therapy session designed to justify abandoning your dying mother. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time, wondering if this was what dying felt like. Not the cancer eating away at your organs, but the people you love eating away at your reasons for wanting to live. That night, a social worker came to my room. Jennifer, her name was, with kind eyes and a gentle voice that somehow made everything worse. She'd been assigned to help me transition to long-term care, since I obviously couldn't manage on my own and my family had indicated they wouldn't be providing support. My family had indicated. Like it was a corporate decision made in a boardroom somewhere. Jennifer helped me understand what my options were, and they weren't good. My insurance would cover some extended care, but not the kind of place where you'd want to spend your final months. We were talking about state facilities, shared rooms with strangers, minimal staff, the kind of places where people went to die forgotten. Unless, Jennifer suggested gently, there was some other family who might help. She'd tried calling the numbers I'd given her for Marcus and Jessica, but they'd made it clear they wouldn't be taking responsibility for my care. That phrase, taking responsibility, echoed in my head for hours. Like I was a mistake they needed to clean up rather than a person who'd devoted her life to raising one of them. On Thursday morning, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the medications wearing off, maybe it was the full realization of what was happening, but I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced since my diagnosis. The grief and shock were still there, but underneath them was something harder, sharper. I was angry. I called Linda and told her everything. She was quiet for a long time after I finished, then said she was booking a flight to come see me. But I told her not to. She had her own family, her own responsibilities, and besides, there was something I needed to do first. That afternoon, I had Jennifer help me make another call. This one was to a lawyer, not one of the fancy ones Marcus and Jessica were probably using, but a guy named Tom Wheeler who handled basic estate planning and family law out of an office above the hardware store downtown. I'd seen his ads in the local paper for years. Tom came to see me that evening, after visiting hours, bringing paperwork and a legal pad and the first honest conversation I'd had with anyone in weeks. I told him about the lottery ticket, about the promises that had been made and broken, about being abandoned in a hospital bed by the people I'd sacrificed everything for. But what I really wanted to talk about was something else entirely. Something I'd remembered during the long, painful hours of lying alone in that hospital bed. A detail from the day Marcus and Jessica bought that ticket, a small thing that hadn't seemed important at the time. Tom listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions that made it clear he understood exactly what I was dealing with. When I finished talking, he sat back in his chair and smiled, not a happy smile, but the smile of someone who'd just realized his client had more options than anyone expected. Because sometimes, when people get greedy, when they let money make them cruel and careless, they forget to check the details. They forget that the law protects people in ways they might not have considered. They forget that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are exactly what someone like them deserves. Tomorrow, Tom said, we were going to make some calls. We were going to ask some very specific questions about a certain lottery ticket and who exactly had the right to claim the winnings. And then we were going to remind Marcus and Jessica that abandoning someone doesn't mean you get to keep what was never entirely yours to begin with. Friday morning brought Tom Wheeler back to my hospital room, but this time he wasn't alone. With him was a woman named Catherine Mills, sharp-eyed and professional, carrying a briefcase that looked like it meant business. She introduced herself as an investigator who specialized in lottery fraud and family disputes, the kind of person you call when winning turns ugly. Tom had spent Thursday evening making phone calls and pulling records. What they'd discovered made my heart race faster than any medication they'd pumped into my veins. The story Marcus and Jessica had told me about buying that ticket wasn't exactly true. Catherine opened her briefcase and pulled out copies of documents that would have made my son's new lawyers very uncomfortable. Security camera footage, timestamps from the gas station, credit card records, cell phone data. The kind of evidence that tells a story people probably wished would stay buried. Here's what really happened that morning 3 weeks before my diagnosis. Marcus had been at my apartment, helping me clean out old boxes from the closet. A rare visit that I treasured at the time. While I was in the kitchen making coffee, he'd gone through my mail, including the bills I'd been struggling to pay and the small stack of lottery tickets I bought every week. It was a silly habit, I knew, spending $5 a week I could barely afford on dreams that would never come true. But one of those dreams had come true. The winning numbers had been drawn 2 days earlier. I'd bought the ticket but never checked it, the way I never checked them anymore. After years of losing, I'd stopped bothering to compare numbers, just let them accumulate in a drawer with old receipts and expired coupons. Marcus had checked it, though. Marcus had seen those matching numbers and made a decision that would have destroyed him legally if anyone ever found out. He'd pocketed my ticket and told Jessica they needed to go buy lottery tickets right away, that he had a feeling about certain numbers. They'd gone to the same gas station where I'd bought the winning ticket. They'd bought a new ticket with different numbers that didn't win anything. But they'd kept my winning ticket and destroyed theirs, creating a story about Jessica buying the winner when actually, legally, I was the rightful winner of $30 million. Catherine showed me the evidence methodically, piece by piece. The timestamp on the store camera showing Jessica buying a losing ticket 47 minutes after Marcus had left my apartment. The credit card record showing the purchase of that worthless piece of paper. The cell phone data showing Marcus's location at my apartment exactly when he would have been going through my mail. And most damning of all, a partial fingerprint on the winning ticket that wasn't Jessica's and wasn't Marcus's. It was mine, from when I'd originally purchased it 3 days before their supposed big win. The crime was theft, plain and simple. But it was worse than that, because it was theft committed by someone I'd trusted with everything, someone I'd raised to know right from wrong, someone who'd looked me in the eye and lied while I was dying. Tom explained the legal situation carefully. We had enough evidence to prove fraud, enough to invalidate their claim to the lottery money, enough to potentially send Marcus to prison for felony theft. But pursuing criminal charges would be complicated, expensive, and time-consuming, time I might not have. There was another option, though. A faster one. A more direct one. We could confront them with the evidence and offer a deal. Return what was rightfully mine, or face criminal prosecution and lose everything anyway. Let me decide how to handle my own lottery winnings, or watch their new life disappear in handcuffs and legal fees. Catherine smiled when she explained this option, the same predatory smile I'd seen on nature documentaries when big cats cornered their prey. She'd handled cases like this before, she said. People who got greedy and careless, who thought they were smarter than the law, who forgot that stealing from family was still stealing. The beautiful part was that they'd already started spending the money. The house, the cars, the clothes, the lifestyle, all of it based on winnings that legally belonged to me. Every purchase they'd made with stolen money just added to the evidence against them. I asked Tom what would happen if we proved the ticket was mine. He pulled out a calculator and started running numbers that made my head spin in the best possible way. $30 million, minus taxes, minus legal fees, but plus penalties and interest they'd owe me for the money they'd already spent. We were talking about enough money to afford the best medical care in the world, enough to live comfortably for whatever time I had left, enough to make sure I'd never be abandoned in a state facility while thieves lived in mansions bought with my dreams. But there was something else I wanted, something that mattered more than money. I wanted to see their faces when they realized what they'd done. I wanted to watch them understand that their cruelty had been built on a foundation of theft, that their new life was a house of cards about to collapse. I wanted them to know that the woman they'd abandoned in a hospital bed was the same woman who owned everything they thought was theirs. Catherine checked her watch and suggested we move fast. The longer Marcus and Jessica had to spend and hide the money, the more complicated recovery would become. She could have legal papers drawn up by Monday, could have law enforcement ready to freeze assets, could make this nightmare end as quickly as it had begun. But I had a better idea. Instead of lawyers and police and formal legal proceedings, I wanted to handle this personally. I wanted to give them one chance to do the right thing, to choose family over greed, to prove they had some shred of humanity left. I wanted to tell them myself that I knew the truth. Tom looked worried about this plan, but Catherine understood. Sometimes, she said, the most effective justice was also the most personal. Sometimes people needed to look into the eyes of someone they'd wronged and realize exactly what kind of people they'd become. We agreed to meet again on Monday to finalize our strategy. But first, I was going to make a phone call that would change everything for everyone involved. The funny thing about revenge is that it tastes best when the people who've wronged you serve it to themselves, when their own greed and cruelty become the weapons you use against them. Marcus and Jessica were about to discover that abandoning someone doesn't make you safe from them. Sometimes, it just makes you more vulnerable than you ever imagined possible. The call I made to Marcus that Saturday afternoon was different from all the others. Instead of pleading or trying to maintain connection, I simply told him I needed to see them both. There were things we needed to discuss about my medical situation and my estate planning. Important things that couldn't wait. My voice was calm, controlled, nothing like the desperate woman who'd been begging for scraps of attention from her own son. This got his attention in a way my previous calls hadn't. When people think you're dying, they become very interested in conversations about wills and inheritances. They agreed to visit me Sunday evening, during the quiet hours when the hospital felt more like a tomb than a place of healing. I spent Saturday night and all of Sunday preparing for what would either be a reconciliation or a declaration of war. Catherine had left me copies of all the evidence, organized in a manila folder that looked innocent enough to keep beside my hospital bed. Tom had briefed me on exactly what to say, how to present the information, what legal phrases would make the biggest impact. But mostly, I just practiced staying calm while my heart hammered with anticipation of seeing their faces when the truth came out. They arrived at 7:30 p.m., both of them looking uncomfortable in the sterile hospital environment. Marcus was wearing the expensive clothes and gold watch I'd glimpsed through the bank window, while Jessica carried a purse that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. They looked successful, confident, like people whose problems had all been solved by a single lucky number. They were about to learn how quickly luck can change. The conversation started predictably. They sat in the uncomfortable chairs beside my bed, making small talk about my treatment, asking surface-level questions about how I was feeling. Marcus even held my hand for a moment, a gesture that might have meant something if I hadn't known what I knew. I let them perform their caring family routine for about 10 minutes before I reached for the manila folder. When I pulled out the first photograph, the timestamp from the gas station security camera, Jessica's face went white so fast I thought she might faint. Marcus looked confused at first, then suspicious, then something approaching panic as I laid out photo after photo, document after document, building the case against them piece by methodical piece. The room grew silent except for the beeping of my monitors and the sound of Jessica's breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Marcus tried to bluff at first, suggesting the evidence was somehow mistaken, that there had to be an explanation. But when I showed him the fingerprint analysis, when I explained exactly how we knew he'd been in my apartment going through my mail, his defenses crumbled. Then came the part I'd been waiting for, the moment that would define what kind of people they really were when stripped of their pretenses and excuses. I gave them a choice. They could return what was rightfully mine, quietly and completely, allowing us to work out some arrangement for my care and their future. Or they could face criminal prosecution for felony theft, lose everything anyway, and spend the next several years dealing with lawyers and prison sentences and the complete destruction of their reputations. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Jessica spoke, and her words revealed exactly who she'd been all along, stripped of the fake concern and manufactured affection. She said I was a pathetic old woman trying to steal their good fortune. She said I was jealous and bitter and desperate to destroy their happiness out of spite. She accused me of fabricating evidence, of bribing investigators, of being exactly the kind of toxic person they were right to cut out of their lives. But it was what Marcus said next that truly broke my heart. He looked at me lying in that hospital bed, connected to machines that were keeping me alive, fighting cancer that was slowly winning, and he told me I was being selfish. He said I'd had my whole life to make something of myself and had failed, and now I was trying to drag them down with me rather than be happy for their success. Then he said the words that would haunt him forever: "Why can't you just be grateful we visited you at all? Most people would have given up on someone like you years ago." Someone like me. A woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise him, who'd worked double shifts to pay for his education, who'd never missed a birthday or a school play or a moment when he needed her. That's when I smiled. Not a happy smile, not a sad smile, but the smile of someone who'd just watched her enemies reveal exactly how little mercy they deserved. I reached for my phone and dialed Catherine's number, putting her on speaker so everyone could hear. Within minutes, she'd confirmed that the paperwork was ready, that law enforcement was standing by, that we could have their assets frozen and criminal charges filed before they left the hospital. Marcus and Jessica sat there listening to their new life being dismantled in real time, their faces growing paler with each legal term Catherine rattled off. But I wasn't done yet. I told them about the house they'd bought with my money, how it would be seized. About the cars they'd purchased, the clothes, the jewelry, the lifestyle they'd been flaunting, all of it bought with stolen winnings, all of it evidence of their crime. And then I told them about something else Catherine had discovered. Their spending had been so extravagant, so immediate and careless, that they'd already blown through nearly $3 million in just over a month. Money that was never theirs to spend, money that they'd now owe me back with interest and penalties. Jessica started crying then, not from sadness but from the realization that they were about to lose everything and face criminal charges besides. Marcus just stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time, like he was finally understanding that the weak, dying woman he'd abandoned was actually someone much more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. That's when I made them an offer that would test just how far their greed had corrupted them. I would give them a choice, one final chance to prove they had any humanity left. They could return every penny, publicly acknowledge what they'd done, and accept supervised visitation with me during my remaining time. In exchange, I wouldn't press criminal charges. Or they could walk out of that hospital room right now, refuse to return what was mine, and face the full legal consequences of stealing $30 million from a dying woman. The choice would reveal everything about who they'd become, and everything about what they valued more than family, more than love, more than basic human decency. Their answer would determine whether this story ended with redemption or with the kind of revenge that people remember for generations. Marcus and Jessica looked at each other across my hospital bed, having what felt like an entire conversation without words. I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, weighing the money they'd already spent against the money they'd lose, measuring their pride against the very real possibility of prison time. Jessica was the first to break, her voice shaking with something between rage and desperation. She accused me of manipulating the situation, of using my illness as emotional blackmail, of being vindictive and cruel. But underneath all her anger, I could hear something else: fear. The bone-deep terror of someone who'd gotten comfortable with wealth that was never legally theirs and now faced losing everything. Marcus was quieter, but his silence was more damning than Jessica's accusations. He sat there staring at his hands that had stolen from me while I was making him coffee, hands that had signed papers claiming money that belonged to his dying mother, hands that had pushed me away when I tried to hold them for comfort. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. He said they needed time to consult with their legal team and fully understand their options. He talked about fair resolution and family healing in the same tone he might use to negotiate a business deal. But what he didn't say was more revealing than what he did. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't deny what they'd done. He didn't ask for forgiveness or express any regret about abandoning me when I needed them most. That's when I realized something that should have broken my heart but instead filled me with a cold, clean clarity. I was mourning a son who had never really existed. The Marcus I thought I'd raised, the one I'd sacrificed everything for, was a fiction I'd created to justify 24 years of putting his needs before my own. The real Marcus was sitting right in front of me, more concerned about protecting stolen money than protecting the relationship with his dying mother. I gave them 24 hours to decide. Catherine had prepared 2 sets of paperwork. The first was a civil settlement agreement that would return my winnings, establish a care fund for my medical expenses, and allow them to keep a small portion of what remained after taxes and legal fees, enough to live comfortably but not enough to fund the extravagant lifestyle they'd been building. The second was a criminal complaint that would result in felony charges, asset seizure, and likely prison time for both of them. They left that night without choosing, but their body language told me everything I needed to know. The way Jessica clutched her expensive purse, The way Marcus avoided eye contact, the way they walked out of my room like they were fleeing a crime scene rather than leaving their dying mother. They were going to choose the money. Monday morning confirmed my prediction. Instead of Marcus or Jessica calling me directly, I received a call from their lawyer, a slick-sounding man named Richard Ashworth who specialized in lottery law and white-collar defense. He informed me, in the most condescending tone possible, that his clients disputed my allegations and would be defending their legitimate claim to the lottery winnings. He actually used the phrase frivolous lawsuit when referring to my attempt to recover my own stolen money. That afternoon, Catherine and Tom met me in my hospital room with news that should have been devastating but instead felt like liberation. Marcus and Jessica had not only refused the settlement, they'd doubled down on their theft. They'd hired expensive lawyers, were planning to fight the case in court, and had even started talking to media outlets about being targeted by a vindictive relative. They were going to make this public. They were going to turn their theft of my lottery winnings into a story about a bitter, dying woman trying to destroy their happiness. That's when I realized they'd made the biggest mistake possible. They'd underestimated me. Catherine smiled when I told her I wanted to escalate everything. No more private negotiations, no more family meetings, no more chances for redemption. I wanted the criminal charges filed immediately. I wanted their assets frozen. I wanted the media attention they seemed so eager for, because the truth has a way of sounding different when it's backed up by fingerprint evidence and security camera footage. But most importantly, I wanted them to understand that there are consequences for abandoning someone who has nothing left to lose. Within hours, Catherine had contacted the district attorney's office, the state lottery commission, and 3 different news outlets. By Tuesday morning, the story was everywhere. Local couple accused of stealing $30 million lottery ticket from dying mother. The headlines were devastating, but the details were worse. Every piece of evidence we'd gathered, every timeline of their deception, every record of their extravagant spending while their supposed loved one fought cancer alone, all of it became public record. Marcus's employer suspended him pending investigation. Jessica's law firm put her on administrative leave. Their new friends in the expensive neighborhood where they'd bought their mansion suddenly became very hard to reach. But the real blow came when the Lottery Commission announced they were freezing all payments on the disputed ticket pending resolution of the criminal investigation. No more money flowing into their accounts. No more funding for their stolen dreams. Wednesday morning, my phone rang at 6:30 a.m. Marcus's voice was different this time, smaller, scared, stripped of the confidence that had carried him through our hospital confrontation. He wanted to meet, he said. He wanted to work something out before this went any further. He used words like misunderstanding and family and forgiveness, the same words he'd been unable to find when I was begging for basic decency. I told him it was too late for that. The criminal investigation was out of my hands now. The state had decided that stealing $30 million from anyone, even your own dying mother, was worth prosecuting to the full extent of the law. But there was something else I wanted him to know, something that would make the next few months even more unbearable for both of them. I was getting better. The latest tests had shown that my cancer was responding to treatment in ways the doctors hadn't expected. I wasn't dying as quickly as they'd thought. Which meant I was going to be around to see justice served, to watch their trial, to testify about what it felt like to be abandoned by the people you devoted your life to protecting. I was going to live long enough to see them face the consequences of choosing money over love, greed over family, cruelty over compassion. And I was going to enjoy every single moment of it. The trial began on a cold February morning, 4 months after that devastating hospital confrontation. By then, the story had taken on a life of its own, becoming one of those cases that people follow obsessively because it touches every nerve about family, money, and betrayal. I was stronger by then, the cancer held in check by treatments I could now afford with my recovered lottery winnings. Not cured, I'd never be cured, but stable enough to sit in that courtroom every single day, watching Marcus and Jessica face the consequences of their choices. The prosecution's case was devastating in its simplicity. Catherine and Tom had done their work well, building an airtight timeline that showed exactly how the theft had occurred and exactly how extensive the cover-up had been. Security footage, fingerprint evidence, cell phone records, financial transactions, all of it pointing to the same inescapable conclusion. Marcus had stolen my lottery ticket and conspired with Jessica to claim winnings that legally belonged to me. They'd spent millions of dollars that wasn't theirs while abandoning me to fight cancer alone. When confronted with evidence of their crime, they'd chosen to double down rather than make amends. But the most damaging testimony came from something I hadn't expected, their own behavior after being caught. The prosecutor introduced evidence showing that even after being confronted with proof of their theft, Marcus and Jessica had continued spending my money. They'd bought jewelry, taken expensive vacations, purchased art and electronics and luxury items worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, all while knowing they were spending money stolen from a dying woman. The defense tried to paint me as a vindictive mother trying to destroy her son's good fortune out of jealousy. Their lawyer, Richard Ashworth, suggested that I'd given Marcus permission to take the ticket, that this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by family drama. But that strategy fell apart when the prosecution played the recording. Catherine had been thorough in her investigation, including requesting security footage from the hospital's patient floor. The night of our confrontation, when Marcus and Jessica had made their choice clear, the conversation had been captured by hallway security cameras with audio recording capabilities. The jury got to hear Jessica calling me a pathetic old woman. They heard Marcus tell me I should be grateful they visited at all. They heard both of them refusing to return money they knew was stolen, choosing instead to let me die in a state facility while they lived in a mansion bought with my dreams. When that recording played in the courtroom, I watched several jurors wipe away tears. But more importantly, I watched Marcus and Jessica realize that their own words had just destroyed any sympathy they might have generated. The real turning point in the trial came during the third week, when the prosecution introduced evidence I hadn't even known existed. Social media posts, deleted but recovered by digital forensics experts, that showed Marcus and Jessica's true feelings about my illness and their obligations toward me. These weren't just private text messages between them. These were posts in closed social media groups, comments on friends' pages, digital conversations with people they trusted enough to show their real personalities to. And what those conversations revealed was breathtaking in its cruelty. Marcus had posted in a support group for adult children of cancer patients, but not the kind of support you'd expect. Instead of asking for advice about caring for a sick parent, he'd been complaining about the financial burden of my treatment and asking whether he was legally required to help pay for my care. "My mom expects me to drop everything and take care of her," one post read. "But I'm 29 years old with my own life and my own problems. How much am I supposed to sacrifice for someone who's probably going to die anyway?" Another post, written just days after my diagnosis: "Is it wrong that I just want to live my life without having to deal with this? I know that sounds terrible, but I didn't sign up to be a caregiver." But Jessica's posts were even worse. In a private Facebook group for wives dealing with difficult in-laws, she'd shared details about my cancer diagnosis that were both intimate and mocking. She described my physical symptoms, my emotional reactions, my financial situation, all with a tone of disgust and annoyance that made it clear she saw me as an obstacle to her happiness rather than a human being fighting for her life. "She's so dramatic about everything," one post read. "Every phone call is about how scared she is or how much pain she's in. Like, we get it, you have cancer. But that doesn't mean the world revolves around you." The post that made several jurors audibly gasp was one where Jessica had responded to another woman complaining about her mother-in-law. "At least yours isn't dying. Mine has maybe 6 months left, and she's trying to make us feel guilty about not wanting to spend every day at the hospital. I swear, some people use their illness as emotional manipulation." Emotional manipulation. She'd written those words about a woman fighting stage 3 cancer who was asking for nothing more than occasional visits and basic support from her family. But the posts that truly revealed their character were the ones written after they'd stolen my lottery ticket but before they'd publicly claimed the winnings. Screenshots recovered from Marcus's phone showed conversations where they discussed how to handle me once they were wealthy. "We can afford professional care now," Marcus had written to Jessica. "Full-time nurses, fancy facilities, whatever it takes to make sure she's comfortable but not our responsibility anymore." Jessica's response: "Thank God. I was dreading having to deal with all the medical stuff. This way we can be generous without having to actually be involved." The prosecution played audio recordings of these conversations. Yes, they'd been careless enough to leave voice messages discussing their plans, and the courtroom was dead silent as the jury heard my son and daughter-in-law casually discussing how to use my own stolen money to get rid of me. "The beautiful thing," Jessica's voice echoed through the speakers, "is that we can set up some kind of trust fund for her care, and then we're legally covered. We'll look like the good guys while basically buying our way out of any obligation to actually be there for her." When that recording ended, I looked at the jury and saw expressions I'd never seen before in a courtroom. Not just disapproval or distaste, but the kind of moral revulsion that comes from witnessing something truly unconscionable. Several jurors were crying. One older man was shaking his head in visible disgust. The defense tried to argue that these were private conversations, that people often say things they don't mean when they're stressed or overwhelmed. But the prosecution's response was devastating. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've heard here aren't momentary lapses in judgment. These are systematic, calculating discussions about how to abandon a dying woman using her own stolen money to ease their conscience. The prosecutor paused, looking directly at Marcus and Jessica before continuing. They didn't just steal Sarah Chen's lottery ticket. They stole her dignity, her security, and her faith in the family she devoted her life to building. And they did it all while planning to use her own money to pay for the guilt they knew they should feel. That afternoon, during a recess, I found myself face to face with Marcus in the courthouse hallway. It was the first time we'd been alone together since the hospital confrontation, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that surprised me. "I never wanted it to go this far, Mom. I never wanted you to get hurt." I looked at this man who'd grown from the baby I'd held in my arms, the child I'd sacrificed everything for, the young man I'd been so proud to see graduate and marry and start building his own life. And I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd lost him completely, not to circumstances or bad influences, but to a fundamental selfishness that had probably always been there, hidden under layers of socially acceptable behavior. "Marcus," I said quietly, "you hurt me the moment you decided I was disposable. Everything since then has just been the consequences." He opened his mouth to argue, to explain, to justify, but I walked away before he could say another word. There was nothing left between us worth hearing, no explanation that could bridge the gap between the mother who'd loved unconditionally and the son who'd put conditions on everything. The trial would end soon, and with it, any possibility of the family I'd thought we were. But for the first time in months, that prospect didn't terrify me. It felt like freedom. But the moment that will stay with me forever came during Marcus's testimony. Under oath, forced to tell the truth or face perjury charges, my son finally admitted what he'd done. He admitted taking the ticket from my apartment. He admitted lying about Jessica buying it. He admitted that they'd known all along that the $30 million belonged to me. But even then, even under oath in front of a jury and with cameras recording every word, he tried to justify it. He said he'd been trying to protect me from the burden of managing so much money while sick. He said he'd planned to take care of me once everything was settled. He actually claimed that stealing from me had been an act of love. That's when the prosecutor asked the question that ended everything. "Mr. Chen, if you were planning to take care of your mother with her own lottery winnings, why did you abandon her in a hospital bed and tell her to handle her medical situation independently?" The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus sat there, under oath, unable to answer without admitting that every word he'd just said was a lie. Unable to explain how leaving your dying mother alone while spending her money on luxury items could possibly be construed as love. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Felony theft, conspiracy, fraud, elder abuse. Jessica received 8 years in state prison plus restitution and penalties. Marcus, as the primary perpetrator and my son, got 12 years. But the real punishment wasn't the prison sentences, it was watching them finally understand what they'd lost. In the moments after the verdict was read, as the bailiffs moved to take them into custody, Marcus looked at me across that courtroom with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not defiance, but something like recognition. Like he was finally seeing me clearly for the first time in his adult life. He mouthed the word sorry, but it was too late for that. 24 years too late, actually. Because I realized, sitting there watching my son be led away in handcuffs, that he'd been taking from me his entire life. My time, my energy, my resources, my dreams, all of it sacrificed for someone who saw me as a source of supply rather than a person deserving of love. The lottery ticket had just been the final, most obvious theft in a lifetime of smaller ones. After the trial, Catherine helped me establish a foundation for cancer patients whose families had abandoned them. We called it Second Chances, and it's funded entirely by my lottery winnings. Money that's now helping people who understand what it feels like to fight for your life while the people you trusted most fight to take what's yours. I also bought a house, not a mansion, just a comfortable place with a garden where I can sit in the morning sun and think about the difference between justice and revenge. Justice is what happened in that courtroom. Revenge is what I'm living now. A peaceful life funded by money that was always mine, surrounded by people who choose to care about me rather than what I can give them. Marcus writes to me sometimes from prison. Long letters full of apologies and explanations and promises about who he'll be when he gets out. I read them all, but I don't respond. There's nothing left to say to someone who had to lose everything before he could see what he'd thrown away. Some people might say I should forgive him, that holding on to anger will only hurt me in the end. But this isn't anger anymore, it's clarity. The clarity that comes from finally understanding that love isn't something you can steal, and money isn't something that makes you family. The cancer is still there, still fighting its slow war inside my body. But I'm winning, one day at a time, in ways that have nothing to do with cell counts and everything to do with understanding my own worth. And every morning when I wake up in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by people who chose to love me without expecting anything in return, I smile. Not because my son is in prison, but because I'm finally free from the prison of loving people more than they loved me. That's a kind of freedom you can't buy with any lottery ticket, no matter how much it's worth. 2 years have passed since that courtroom victory, and I'm writing this final chapter from my garden on a warm spring morning, watching tomatoes grow from seeds I planted with my own hands. It's a simple pleasure, but after everything I've been through, simple pleasures feel like miracles. The cancer is still with me, it always will be, but it's manageable now. The best doctor's money can buy have given me treatments that weren't available when I was lying in that hospital bed, abandoned and dying. I have time now, precious time that Marcus and Jessica's theft could have stolen from me forever. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if you've listened to every painful detail of betrayal and revenge and justice, I want you to know that you're the reason I'm telling it. Because somewhere out there, someone else is lying in their own hospital bed, or sitting in their own kitchen, or staring at their own phone, wondering if the people they love actually love them back. I want that person to know that your worth isn't determined by how other people treat you. It's not measured by who calls you back, who visits you, who chooses you when things get difficult. Your worth exists independent of other people's ability to recognize it. The foundation I started has helped over 300 people in the last 2 years. Cancer patients whose families disappeared when treatment got expensive, elderly people whose children were more interested in inheritance than care, disabled individuals whose relatives saw them as burdens rather than human beings. Every story breaks my heart, but every person we help puts it back together again. The months following the trial brought unexpected challenges that had nothing to do with legal victories or financial recovery. Having your worldview completely shattered and rebuilt, even for the better, creates a kind of psychological whiplash that no one warns you about. I had everything I'd fought for, my money returned with interest, Marcus and Jessica facing the consequences of their choices, and the legal vindication that proved I hadn't been paranoid or vindictive. I'd been a victim of deliberate, calculated cruelty. But winning doesn't immediately erase the damage that was done to your ability to trust, to love, to believe in the fundamental goodness of people. The foundation work helped, but it also exposed me to story after story of family betrayal that sometimes left me wondering if genuine love and loyalty were the exceptions rather than the rules. Every week brought new cases, adult children who'd drained their parents' accounts, siblings who'd fought over inheritances while their relatives were still alive, families who'd abandoned members with disabilities or chronic illnesses because care was expensive and inconvenient. It was Linda who finally forced me to confront what I was becoming. During one of her visits, she sat me down in my garden and delivered one of those brutally honest conversations that only sisters can have with each other. "Sarah," she said, "you're turning bitter, and I understand why. But you're also turning into someone who expects the worst from everyone, and that's not who you raised Marcus to be, and it's not who you are either." She was right, and I hated her for it. Somewhere in my journey from victim to victor, I'd started viewing every human interaction through the lens of potential betrayal. I'd become suspicious of kindness, always looking for hidden motives, always waiting for the moment when people would reveal their true, selfish nature. The volunteers at the foundation had started walking on eggshells around me because I'd become hypercritical of any small mistake or oversight. When someone forgot to return a phone call promptly, I saw it as evidence of their lack of commitment. When donors asked questions about how their money was being used, I interpreted it as distrust rather than legitimate curiosity. I was becoming the kind of person who'd been hurt so badly that she couldn't recognize genuine care when it was offered freely. The turning point came through an unexpected source, a letter from Marcus. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 8 months after his sentencing, written on prison stationery in handwriting I hadn't seen since his childhood thank you notes. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I found the courage to open it, and when I finally did, what I found wasn't what I'd expected. It wasn't an apology, exactly, and it wasn't an attempt to manipulate me into forgiveness or leniency. Instead, it was something rarer and more valuable. A completely honest account of how he'd become the kind of person who could steal from his dying mother. Marcus wrote about growing up feeling like he could never live up to my sacrifices, never be worthy of the love and effort I'd invested in him. Instead of inspiring gratitude, my devotion had created a kind of resentment, not conscious, but persistent, about being the center of someone else's life in a way that felt more like obligation than choice. He described feeling guilty about my loneliness after his father left, guilty about the sacrifices I'd made for his education, guilty about building his own life while I remained focused primarily on supporting his. But instead of talking to me about these feelings, he'd pushed them down and let them ferment into something toxic. When Jessica came into our lives, she'd given him permission to see my love as unhealthy rather than generous, my concern as controlling rather than caring. She'd helped him reframe our relationship in ways that made his growing distance seem like healthy boundary setting rather than what it actually was, the slow abandonment of someone who'd never abandoned him. The lottery ticket, he wrote, had felt like a solution to years of accumulated guilt. If they were wealthy, they could take care of me financially without having to give me the emotional connection I craved. They could be good children by paying for my care while maintaining the distance that had become comfortable for them. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly financial generosity would turn into justification for complete emotional abandonment. Once they started thinking of me as someone they were taking care of rather than someone they loved, it became easier to see me as a burden they were generous to carry at all. The letter was devastating in its honesty, but it was also oddly healing. For the first time, I understood that Marcus's cruelty hadn't come from not loving me. It had come from not knowing how to love me in a way that didn't make him feel suffocated by obligation and guilt. That doesn't excuse what he did. Nothing excuses stealing from your dying mother and abandoning her in a hospital bed. But understanding the psychology behind it helped me separate his actions from my worth as a person and as a mother. I'd been a good mother, maybe too good, in ways that had inadvertently created problems I'd never intended. But his inability to handle those complications with honesty and compassion was about his character, not about failures in my love. The letter ended with something that surprised me, a request that I not write back, not visit, not try to maintain any kind of relationship with him. Not because he didn't want to hear from me, but because he was finally mature enough to understand that I deserved better than someone who'd proven he couldn't be trusted with my heart. "You raised me to be better than I became," he wrote. "The best thing I can do for you now is let you find people who are actually capable of being what I should have been." I cried when I finished that letter, but they weren't tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of relief, relief that the son I'd loved was still in there somewhere, buried under years of poor choices and selfish justifications, and that maybe prison would give him the time and space to become someone worth knowing again. But more than that, they were tears of liberation. Permission, finally, to stop trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved, to stop investing my emotional energy in relationships that would never give me back what I put into them. I never wrote back to Marcus, as he'd requested. But I kept his letter, and sometimes when I was working with foundation clients who were struggling with family betrayal, I'd share parts of it, with his permission, obtained through his lawyer, to help them understand that sometimes the people who hurt us most are also suffering, even if their suffering doesn't excuse their actions. Understanding doesn't require forgiveness, and forgiveness doesn't require relationship. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away and let people face the consequences of their choices without your interference, your excuses, or your attempts to fix what they've broken. That realization changed everything about how I approached the final years of my life, and how I learned to love people without losing myself in the process. Jessica serves her sentence in silence. No letters, no requests for visits, no attempts at reconciliation. Maybe she's learned something from this experience, or maybe she's just planning her next move. Either way, it's not my responsibility anymore. The house they bought with my money was sold to pay restitution. The cars, the jewelry, the luxury items, all of it liquidated to pay back what they stole, plus interest and penalties. They lost everything they'd gained and more, just as the law intended. But the real loss wasn't financial. The real loss was the relationship we might have had if they'd chosen differently. If they'd chosen love over money, family over greed, compassion over cruelty. That relationship is gone forever, not because of what I chose to do, but because of who they chose to be. I've learned that you can't love someone into being a better person. You can't sacrifice enough, give enough, or forgive enough to change someone who doesn't want to change. All you can do is decide what you'll accept and what you won't, then live accordingly. These days, my life is full of people who chose to be in it. Linda visits every few months, and we've grown closer than we ever were as children. My neighbors, the volunteers at the foundation, the medical team that keeps me healthy. These are my family now, chosen and cherished because they see value in me that has nothing to do with what I can provide. I still play the lottery sometimes, usually the same $5 a week I spent before I won. Not because I need the money now, but because I like the reminder that luck can change everything in an instant. Good luck, bad luck, the luck of meeting the right people at the right time, the luck of discovering who someone really is before it's too late to protect yourself. The other day, a young woman came to the foundation, 28 years old, single mother, diagnosed with breast cancer while her boyfriend left and her family made excuses about why they couldn't help. She reminded me so much of myself at that age, scared and alone and wondering if anyone would fight for her since she was too tired to fight for herself. We're paying for her treatment, her childcare, her housing while she recovers. But more than that, we're showing her that she matters, that her life has value, that someone cares whether she lives or dies. It won't change what her family did to her, but it might change how she sees herself. That's what this whole experience taught me. You can't control how people treat you, but you can control how you respond. You can choose bitterness or peace, revenge or justice, isolation or connection. Every day, you get to decide who you want to be regardless of who other people have proven themselves to be. Marcus and Jessica chose money over love, and they lost both. I chose to fight for justice and found peace instead. Not the peace of getting even, but the peace of understanding my own worth and surrounding myself with people who see it too. If you're watching this from a place of pain, from a hospital bed or a lonely apartment or anywhere else where love feels scarce, I want you to know something. You are worthy of care, of kindness, of people who choose you not because of what you can do for them but because of who you are. And if the people in your life can't see that, if they abandon you when you need them most or steal from you when you're vulnerable, that's not a reflection of your worth, it's a revelation of theirs. The sun is setting over my garden now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that no amount of money could buy. Tomorrow I'll wake up in my own bed, make my own coffee, tend my own flowers. Simple pleasures that feel like victories because they're mine, chosen freely, paid for with money that was always rightfully mine. Marcus is somewhere out there, starting over with nothing but the clothes on his back and the knowledge of what he threw away. Jessica is counting down her remaining sentence, possibly planning her next move or possibly learning to live with consequences. But I'm here, alive and thriving and surrounded by love that costs nothing and gives everything. I'm here to tell this story so that someone else might recognize the signs earlier, might choose themselves sooner, might understand that real family isn't about blood or obligation, it's about choice and care and showing up when it matters. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for letting me share the darkest and brightest moments of these last few years. Thank you for being the kind of person who cares enough about other people's pain to sit through a long story about betrayal and justice and the complicated mathematics of forgiveness. If this story helped you in any way, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe so you can hear more stories about survival and strength and the amazing things that can happen when you finally understand your own worth. And remember, your value doesn't decrease based on someone's inability to see it. You are worthy of love, care, and loyalty, not because of what you can give, but because of who you are. Never let anyone convince you otherwise.